Washington, D.C., 1963. The marble corridors of the United States Senate hum with reporters, flashing cameras, and the faint scent of cigar smoke. At the center of it all, sitting beneath the glaring lights, is a man who was never meant to be seen. Joseph Valachi adjusts his prison-issued suit, the fabric rough against his skin. The room is packed. Senators, journalists, FBI agents, and men in tailored suits who say nothing but watch everything. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk asks. Valachi nods. His voice is quiet, cracked with age and nerves. "Yeah, I swear." For decades, the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, has lived in shadows, denied by its members and dismissed by the government as rumor. But now, under oath, a made man is about to reveal the structure, rituals, and crimes of the most secret brotherhood in America. Behind Valachi's eyes flickers a lifetime. Blood oaths in dim basements, whispered orders over coffee, friends turned enemies, and corpses buried under silence. The word rat echoes in his memory like a curse. He clears his throat, leans toward the microphone, and says the words that will change everything. Cosa Nostra. That means our thing. The room goes still. Pens stop moving. The cameras whir. For the first time, the American public will hear the Mafia's inner secrets, from one of its own. Chapter 1. The Streets Choose You, New York City, 1910s. The Bronx is a maze of smoke and brick. Streetlights flicker, children chase stickballs through alleys, and the scent of bread from Italian bakeries mingles with the stink of the docks. Amid the chaos, a wiry kid with sharp eyes and quicker hands learns one truth early. The streets choose you long before you ever choose them. Joe Valachi, son of poor Neapolitan immigrants, grows up in a world where survival is a full-time trade. His father works odd jobs. His mother prays every night for her boy to stay out of trouble. But Joe finds his education elsewhere. On the corners, in the whispers between thieves, in the glances exchanged before a fight breaks out. "I wasn't born bad," Valachi would later say. "I just had bad surroundings." By 16, he's running with the Minutemen, a small-time Bronx gang that steals cars, breaks into warehouses, and delivers the goods to men who never get their hands dirty. Joe earns a reputation fast, not for cruelty, but for precision. He plans every job like a chess match, quick and clean. A veteran crook named Tony the shoemaker. Raina notices him one night after a warehouse hit. Raina leans against a Packard, cigarette glowing in the dark. "Kid," he says, flicking the ash. "You don't talk much. You think before you move. That's good. That'll keep you alive." Joe shrugs. "Thinking's cheaper than dying." Raina laughs. "You'll fit in fine." By the 1920s, Prohibition transforms New York's underworld into a booming marketplace. Every alley hums with liquor trucks, every bar a speakeasy. The gangs become families, and the families become empires. The street punks who once fought over scraps now handle fortunes in bootleg whiskey. Valachi's crew begins running deliveries for the Raina family, part of a growing Sicilian network under Salvatore Maranzano, a name whispered with both reverence and fear. Joe learns the rituals, the rules, the silence. Never talk outside the family. Never steal from your own. Never touch a made man. At 25, Joe gets his first serious taste of blood. A rival hijacks one of Raina's trucks. Raina calls Joe in. "We can't let this stand," Raina says, his tone calm, surgical. "You handle it clean. Quick. No mess." Joe nods, heart pounding. That night, under the shadow of a bridge, he does what's asked. He doesn't brag, doesn't boast. He just delivers results. The next morning, Raina's men nod to him differently. He's no longer a street kid. He's earned trust, the first currency of the Mafia. But trust is fragile. When Raina is murdered in 1930 during the bloody Castellamarese War, Joe's loyalty is thrown into chaos. He watches as Joe, the boss Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano tear the underworld apart. Valachi, just a soldier, learns to survive by keeping his head down. In the spring of 1931, after Masseria's death, Valachi finds himself summoned to a quiet restaurant in the Bronx. The man waiting for him is Gaetano, Tommy, Lucchese. Small, soft-spoken, dangerous. Lucchese studies him for a moment. You were Reina's man. You kept your mouth shut. You did what had to be done. That's what we need now. Men who don't talk, men who last. He slides a small folded card across the table. You're being proposed, Lucchese says. Valachi blinks. Proposed? Lucchese smiles faintly. You'll understand soon enough. Weeks later, Joe stands in a dark basement before Maranzano himself. The ceremony is solemn. A saint's card burns in his hands as he repeats the oath. If I betray my brothers, may I burn like this saint. Blood is drawn. The bond is sealed. Joseph Valachi becomes a made man of the Maranzano family, soon to be reorganized under Lucky Luciano as part of the new Cosa Nostra. But power shifts quickly. Later that year, Maranzano is murdered in his office by Luciano's men. Valachi now answers to Vito Genovese, a calculating underboss who sees something useful in the quiet soldier from the Bronx. Joe, Genovese tells him one evening, you're not a thinker like Luciano, but you're steady. You keep the line. That's worth more than brains sometimes. Valachi bows his head slightly. I just do my part. Genovese nods. Do it well, and there'll always be a place for you. For the next 2 decades, Valachi operates as a mid-level soldier in the Genovese family, running numbers, collecting payments, and keeping peace on the streets. He's not flashy, not ambitious, just reliable. In the Mafia, reliability is life insurance. He marries, buys a small home, raises a family. To the neighbors, he's a quiet Italian tradesman. To the men downtown, he's a cog in the machine that runs the city from behind closed doors. But beneath the calm surface, the system shifts. The Luciano era gives way to Genovese's iron hand. The government begins cracking down. Wiretaps hum. Indictments build. Joe keeps moving, cautious and loyal. Yet somewhere deep inside, a faint unease grows. He's seen too many faces vanish overnight. Too many friends left sleeping with the fishes. Loyalty, Joe mutters one night to a friend, ain't what it used to be. The friend laughs nervously. You getting soft, Joe? Joe's eyes harden. No, just smart enough to know this life don't end clean. The years grind on. Valachi's world, once orderly and bound by honor, begins to corrode. The code that kept men safe now feels like a trap. The silence that protected him now isolates him. And soon, one wrong man, one wrong word, and one paranoid boss will pull him into the darkest chapter of his life. A chapter that will turn soldier into traitor, and silence into confession. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, 1960. The steel doors slam shut behind Joseph Valachi, now 57 years old. The man who once served quietly in the shadows of the Genovese crime family enters a place that smells of sweat, concrete, and fear. The guards call him Old Joe. To the inmates, he is just another mobster, one of dozens locked up in the federal dragnet that is finally catching up to the underworld. But what no one knows, not even Valachi himself, is that this prison will become the stage for one of the most explosive betrayals in Mafia history. He's been convicted of narcotics trafficking, a charge he insists was ordered by Vito Genovese, now the uncontested boss of the family. Genovese runs his empire from inside these same walls, using fear and loyalty as his weapons. Valachi's cellmate, an old bookie from Brooklyn, leans over one night. They say the boss runs this joint like a second headquarters, the man whispers. Joe grunts. I believe it. Man's got longer arms than the government. For months, Valachi keeps to himself. He eats quietly, exercises alone, and keeps his mouth shut. But inside, he's unraveling. The world outside has changed. The Mafia is evolving, greedier, bloodier, more reckless. The new generation doesn't know the old code, and Genovese, once the cold, calculating strategist Joe respected, is now a paranoid tyrant. Rumors swirl through the prison that someone has talked. Genovese, obsessed with rooting out traitors, begins pointing fingers. One by one, men loyal to him start dying in the yard, their deaths made to look like fights or suicides. Then, one morning in 1962, Joe hears his own name whispered in the mess hall. "He's the rat," someone says behind him. The words cut like a blade. Joe turns, but no one meets his eyes. That night he can't sleep. Every sound in the dark makes him tense. A cell door slams. A guard's keys jingle. Somewhere down the corridor, a man screams, and no one asks why. When he finally drifts into uneasy sleep, he dreams of the old days, the Bronx streets, the laughter of his crew, the sound of Raina's voice. But when he wakes, it's back to steel and silence. A week later, a prisoner approaches him in the yard. "Mr. G says hi." The man mutters, eyes shifting. Joe's gut goes cold. He knows what that means. That night, as the prisoners line up for chow, Joe feels a tap on his shoulder. He turns and sees another inmate lunge with a piece of steel sharpened from a spoon handle. Instinct takes over. Joe grabs the attacker's wrist, slams him into a table, and drives his head into the floor. The blade skitters away. When the guards pull them apart, Joe is shaking, adrenaline surging. The attacker, beaten and bloodied, gasps, "Genovese says you're finished," before being dragged off. Valachi sits in solitary confinement for weeks afterward, staring at the gray walls. His heart hammers constantly, waiting for the next strike. He knows Genovese won't stop, not until he's dead. "I'm a walking dead man," he mutters to himself. "The only thing left is to pick who does the burying." When he's finally released from solitary, the prison warden calls him into the office. "Joe, you got enemies on both sides," the warden says. "You don't talk, you're dead. You do talk, maybe you live." Joe looks up slowly. "What the hell you mean? Talk?" The warden leans back. "You've been around long enough to know things, names, how it all works. Washington's listening now." Valachi stares at him, silent. The weight of 50 years in the life presses down on his shoulders. Omertà, the sacred vow of silence. Break it, and you don't just die. You erase yourself from history. But then he thinks of Genovese, the betrayal, the fear, the knife. He slams his fist on the desk. "He turned on me first." The warden nods. Then maybe it's time to turn back. That night, Joe lies awake in his cell, the flickering light casting long shadows on the wall. In his mind, he's back on the streets again, a kid with dirt on his shoes and hunger in his belly, trying to survive. He whispers to himself, "If the streets chose me, maybe it's time I choose something else." The decision comes slowly, painfully, but by dawn it's made. Joseph Valachi will do the unthinkable. He will break omertà, the unspoken code that has kept the Mafia invisible for over half a century. He doesn't do it for fame or for revenge, though both will follow. He does it because, for the first time in his life, the fear of dying silent feels worse than the fear of dying loud. When federal agents come for him a few weeks later, Valachi doesn't resist. He steps into the car, hands cuffed, eyes forward. One of the agents, surprised by his calm, asks, "You really ready to talk, Joe?" Valachi exhales slowly. "Ready," he says. "I've been dying to talk for 30 years. Chapter 3. The Man Who Spoke Washington, D.C., 1963. A swarm of photographers floods the marble steps of the United States Senate. Reporters jostle for position, shouting questions over the clicking of cameras. Inside, the air is tense. Everyone knows what's coming. For the first time in history, a made man of the American Mafia will testify publicly, not in whispers, not behind closed doors, but in front of senators, cameras, and the nation. Joseph Valachi sits alone at the witness table, wearing a plain gray suit that still feels like a prison uniform. His hands tremble slightly, cuff marks still visible on his wrists. On the table before him sits a glass of water, untouched. Behind him, FBI agents watch closely. At the center of the room sits Senator John McClellan, his face hard, eyes sharp. Beside him, a younger man, Robert F. Kennedy, the U.S. Attorney General, leans forward, the light glinting off his papers. The hearing begins. Mr. Valachi, McClellan says. Do you understand that by testifying here today you are placing yourself in grave danger? Valachi nods once. I've been in grave danger all my life. Laughter ripples briefly through the chamber, quickly fading. Kennedy's expression doesn't change. Then let's begin. Valachi takes a breath. For a moment, his mind flashes back to the smoky basement in East Harlem, the night of his initiation. He remembers the candlelight, the prick of the needle, the image of a saint burned in his palm. If you betray this family, may your soul burn as this image burns. He swallows. Then, in a steady voice, he says the word that the world will never forget. Cosa Nostra. Kennedy raises his eyebrows. What does that mean? Valachi leans forward. It means our thing. That's what we called it. The press calls it the Mafia. But that's not what we called it. Inside, it was always Cosa Nostra. The senators scribble notes furiously. Cameras flash. The public, watching on black and white televisions across America, hears for the first time that the Mafia is real. Not a rumor. Not an invention of Hollywood. Valachi begins to talk. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence, as if the words have been waiting for decades. He describes the initiation ritual, the candle, the saint, the blood oath. He names the families, the bosses, the underbosses, the capos, the soldiers. He outlines the structure like a military general, diagramming an army. There's rules, he says. You don't touch a made man without permission. You don't mess with another man's wife. You don't talk about the life, ever. You follow the orders, or you disappear. Kennedy interrupts. Disappear? Valachi nods. They call it getting sent for a ride. You go out, you don't come back. A senator clears his throat. Mr. Valachi, do you expect us to believe that this organization, this Cosa Nostra, controls criminal activity across multiple cities? Valachi meets his gaze. You don't gotta believe me. Just look around. He smirks faintly. The money talks for itself. He begins naming names: Gambino, Bonanno, Lucchese, Profaci, and Genovese, the men who rule the underworld like kings. The senators exchange glances. For the first time, the U.S. government sees the Mafia not as scattered gangs, but as a unified network, an empire built on silence and blood. As the hours pass, Valachi's voice grows rough, but he doesn't stop. He tells of murders ordered in whispers, envelopes passed in the dark, judges bought and sold. The crowd in the gallery shifts uneasily. Even the most hardened reporters can't believe what they're hearing. At one point, Kennedy asks, "Why did you decide to come forward, Mr. Valachi?" Valachi stares down at his hands. "I didn't decide. It decided for me. You don't understand. When the boss marks you, you're already dead. The only thing left is how long you keep breathing." Kennedy studies him for a long moment. "And what do you hope to gain?" "Nothing," Valachi says quietly. "I'm not trying to save myself. I'm just trying to tell it straight for once." There's a pause. Then Kennedy nods, signaling for him to continue. Valachi goes on to explain the inner language of the Mafia, the codes, the gestures, the signals that ordinary people would never notice. He demonstrates how meetings were arranged, how contracts were passed, how killers were chosen. Every revelation lands like a gunshot. He doesn't exaggerate, he doesn't boast. He simply describes, and in doing so, he dismantles decades of myth. By late afternoon, the hearing room feels heavier. The senators are silent now, listening to every word. Even Kennedy, who built his career on prosecuting the mob, looks shaken. Valachi takes a sip of water, then sets the glass down. "I know what I'm doing here. The minute I open my mouth, my life's over. But if I can make one guy think twice before he joins that life, maybe it's worth it." The session adjourns. The senators rise, murmuring among themselves. Valachi is led out by U.S. Marshals through a side door, shielded from the cameras. As he walks down the corridor, his footsteps echo like a metronome. A reporter calls after him. "Joe, you afraid the mob's coming for you?" Valachi stops, glances over his shoulder and says, "They already are." He turns back and disappears through the doorway, the flashbulbs bursting behind him like gunfire. Outside, the newspapers are already rolling. Mafia is real, mobster confesses. America, for the first time, knows the name Cosa Nostra. And in the shadows of New York, the men whose names he spoke begin to whisper one of their own. Valachi. Chapter 4. The Backlash. The ink is barely dry on the newspapers when the storm begins. Across New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, the old dons sit in smoke-filled back rooms, their faces carved in stone. Each headline feels like a betrayal written in fire. Mafia exposed by insider. Valachi names 5 families. Every man in those rooms understands what that means. The wall of silence that protected Cosa Nostra for half a century has been cracked from the inside. In Little Italy, Carlo Gambino sits at a long table, fingers tapping on a glass of Chianti. "Now everyone's looking at us," he murmurs. "Every cop, every reporter, every nobody." A soldier speaks up. He should have been dead before he opened his mouth. Gambino's eyes narrow. "He is dead," he says softly. "He just hasn't stopped breathing yet." Meanwhile, inside the Department of Justice, Robert Kennedy paces a narrow hallway, a file clutched in his hand. Valachi's testimony has given them something they've never had before, a blueprint. For years, the FBI refused to admit the Mafia even existed. Now they have names, ranks, and a structure that matches the military precision Hoover himself demanded. Kennedy steps into a briefing room where young prosecutors hunch over maps of New York. "Gentlemen," he says, "for the first time, we know what we're fighting." He points to 5 circles drawn across the map: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo. Each one a kingdom. Our job is to make them fall. Back in the prison system, Valachi is moved constantly. Atlanta, Leavenworth, Fort Worth. No one tells him where he's going next. Every transfer feels like Russian roulette. Inmates glare when he walks by. One calls out, "Hey, Joe, where's your saint now?" Another slides a folded note across the table at breakfast. A crudely drawn rat, its tail cut off. He eats alone, sleeps light, and keeps a sharpened spoon under his mattress. One night, he hears footsteps outside his cell. The lock clicks once, then twice. He holds his breath. The sound moves on. When he finally exhales, he whispers, "You'll have to do better than that." On the streets, the mob's response is quieter but more brutal. Anyone suspected of sympathy toward Valachi vanishes. A bookmaker in the Bronx found in the trunk of a car. A driver in Jersey beaten until he can't speak. Messages written not in ink, but in blood. A young soldier asks his capo, "Why all this? He's already talking." The capo answers without looking up from his coffee. "Because it reminds the rest what happens when you do." The Senate hearings continue for weeks. Valachi sits under the bright lights, answering every question the government throws at him. Sometimes he cracks a dry joke, sometimes his voice falters. Reporters note the strange mix of guilt and relief in his tone, a man confessing his sins while digging his own grave. Between sessions, Kennedy meets him in a guarded room. "You realize this will never end," Kennedy says quietly. "Even if you disappear, your name won't." Valachi shrugs. "It's already gone. Maybe this way it means something." Kennedy studies him for a moment. "You could have just kept quiet." Joe looks down at his hands. "I kept quiet my whole life. Look what it got me." By winter, the fallout spreads far beyond the hearings. Congress authorizes new funding for organized crime investigations. J. Edgar Hoover, who once mocked the idea of a national mafia, orders his agents to form the Top Hoodlum program. Across the country, hundreds of wiretaps and surveillance operations ignite overnight. In the underworld, panic mixes with fury. Bosses order tighter discipline, fewer meetings, new codes. The word Valachi becomes forbidden, like a curse that could summon death itself. Yet in private, many admit the truth. The code of silence has been broken and nothing will ever fully restore it. In a hidden apartment in Brooklyn, an old capo named Tony Bender pours himself a drink. Used to be we were ghosts, he mutters to a young associate. Now we're front-page news. Ghosts don't survive the daylight. He raises the glass in a bitter toast. To Joe Valachi, may he rot slow. The associate hesitates. You think he did the right thing? Bender stares at him, eyes cold. The right thing don't exist in our world, kid. Only the thing that keeps you breathing. Weeks later, Valachi sits in a dim interview room with a reporter from Life magazine. The journalist asks, "Do you regret it?" Joe leans back, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "I regret joining, not talking. You spend your life digging graves for other people. One day you realize you've been standing in one the whole time." The reporter scribbles the quote down. It will become one of the most famous lines ever spoken by a gangster. Outside, the headlines fade, but the consequences endure. Federal task forces multiply. Informants, once unthinkable, begin to appear in other cases. The mob adapts, but it never fully recovers from the blow of one man's voice echoing through Congress. Inside his cell, Joe Valachi listens to the rain tapping against the window bars. He knows the Mafia hasn't forgiven, hasn't forgotten. He also knows he's still breathing. For now. He mutters to himself. They built a world on silence. I tore it down with a whisper. He lies back on the cot, closes his eyes, and waits for morning. Chapter 5. Life After Betrayal. Valachi doesn't return to the streets. He doesn't go home. By the time his Senate testimony ends, he's no longer a man of the Mafia. He's a man of the government. A new life is forced upon him, one built on anonymity, confinement, and the strange isolation of being alive while everyone he once knew fears or hates him. The Federal Witness Protection Program, still in its infancy, becomes his prison and his shield. Officers escort him from one safe house to another, from New York to Miami, then back to New York again. Every move is calculated, every step measured. At first, the loneliness is unbearable. He walks empty streets at night, the flickering neon of shuttered shops his only company. He cannot enter a diner without suspicion, cannot sit in a park without eyes scanning the horizon. In his mind, every shadow could be a hitman, every stranger an assassin sent by Genovese. One night in a small rented apartment in Queens, he writes in his journal, "I can't remember what it feels like not to be afraid, not for me, but for the people I used to call friends." He begins telling his story to anyone who will listen, historians, reporters, and eventually a ghostwriter who will help him turn decades of whispered secrets into words on a page. The Valachi Papers will not just be a memoir. It will be a blueprint for understanding the Mafia. When the book is published in 1968, it shocks the nation. Readers devour tales of initiation rituals, silent hand signals, hidden codes, and the names of bosses and soldiers who had ruled in shadows for decades. The Mafia's mystique, long a source of fear, fascination, and Hollywood fantasy, is shattered by one man's candid account. Valachi is careful in interviews. He speaks with measured tones, never boasting, never exaggerating. The world sees him as both a traitor and a hero, a man who survived where many others did not. A journalist asks, "Joe, did you ever imagine you'd live this long?" He smiles faintly, eyes reflecting the years of fear and survival. "No," he says quietly, "but I learned a lesson long ago. In this life, it's not about how you die. It's about how long you can keep breathing while everyone else wants you gone." Despite federal protection, he is constantly reminded of the life he abandoned. Letters arrive anonymously, some praising him for telling the truth, others threatening him, their words terse and brutal. "We're watching." He keeps a low profile, avoids contact with family and old associates, and accepts that trust is now a currency he can no longer spend. Even decades later, he cannot forget the faces of the men he once called friends, the friends who now want him dead. And yet there is relief. There is freedom, in a way he never experienced in the Mafia's shadows. He can eat breakfast without fear of being watched. He can walk the street without looking over his shoulder every 2 steps. He can live even if the world still calls him a traitor. As he grows older, he becomes reflective. He revisits the Bronx in his mind. The alleys, the docks, the smoky basements. He remembers Reina, Lucchese, Genovese, men whose names carried weight and whose hands carried blood. He recalls the decisions he made, the blood he spilled, the oaths he swore, and the silence he finally broke. It wasn't betrayal, he tells an interviewer once. It was survival. The law couldn't stop them. The people couldn't stop them. But words could do what bullets never could. Words could make the world see. Valachi knows that history will judge him harshly, that the Mafia will never forgive, and that the streets will whisper his name as long as the shadows exist. But he also knows that he did something no other made man ever dared. He exposed the inner workings of the most secretive and feared criminal organization in the world, and lived to tell the story. In his final years, Valachi retreats further from the public eye. He reads newspapers and watches television, noting how crime evolves, how new bosses rise, how the Mafia continues even after the world thinks it's been contained. One evening, he sits by the window of his safe house, the city lights flickering in the distance. He lights a cigarette, the smoke curling upward. He thinks of the boy he once was, running through the Bronx streets, learning the first rules of survival. He thinks of the men he served, the blood he spilled, the silence he kept, and he whispers to himself, I survived them all, and now I survive myself. Chapter 6. Legacy of a Whisper. The 1970s arrive, and with them, a new era of law enforcement strategy. The FBI, once dismissive of organized crime as myth, now treats it as a national threat. Task forces multiply. Wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations spread across the country. Joe Valachi watches from the sidelines, invisible but omnipresent in their plans. His testimony has laid the foundation. Every agent, every prosecutor, every young detective working the mob now references the names and structures he revealed. Valachi's whisper became a blueprint. In Washington, officials discuss prosecutions that would have been impossible a decade earlier. With Valachi's revelations, they can connect dots, tie families together, and understand the coded rituals that kept the Mafia untouchable. Knowledge is power, and Joe's voice supplied it in full. Across New York, the 5 families adjust. Meetings move to more secure locations. New codes, new rituals, new layers of secrecy. But the damage has been done. The public knows the structure. The government knows the hierarchy. Nothing can return the Mafia to its former invisibility. In Chicago, Las Vegas, and New Jersey, underworld whispers carry his name. Valachi. It is said quietly, in fear and respect, a ghost that walks among the living. Men who once laughed at the law now take it seriously. Every action, every decision, is measured against the precedent of one man who spoke. Valachi himself grows older, quieter. He avoids publicity, but history continues to chase him. Scholars cite him in books, journalists interview him for retrospectives, filmmakers dramatize his story, casting him as the first man to break the unbreakable code. One day, an FBI agent visiting his safe house remarks, "Without you, we'd still be guessing at how the Mafia works." Valachi smirks faintly. Guessing never stops them. Words stop people. He reflects often on loyalty, betrayal, and survival. The life he lived, the choices he made, and the truths he revealed have changed the country's understanding of organized crime forever. People always ask if I regret it, he says in an interview. I tell them I regret joining, not speaking. Speaking saved me, and maybe it saved a few others too. By the time he passes away in 1971, Joe Valachi is a man both reviled and revered, a traitor to some, a hero to many, and a historian of the underworld by circumstance. His testimony reshaped law enforcement, inspired legislation, and created a model for investigating organized crime that would endure for decades. Even now, decades later, the shadow of his voice lingers. In law enforcement manuals, in documentaries, in criminal histories, his name appears. Valachi's whisper, once a single terrifying confession in a Senate hearing, echoes through history as the moment the American Mafia was exposed to the world. And in the quiet corners of New York, in the alleys and basements where men once swore blood oaths, his story is still told. Not loudly, not in celebration, but as a warning. The code can be broken. The silent can speak. The shadows can be exposed. Joseph Valachi's life, his choices and his testimony remind the world that even the most powerful organizations have a weakness, and sometimes it takes only one voice to reveal it all.